done anything yet. I haven't done anything yet, and I don't have slides, so I'm not an artist. But I like y'all. I want to know how y'all have good slide game. It's like intimidating. So, wow, holy shit! Like what an amazing convening this has been, right? I mean, the most incredible group of artists and activists and scholars, those who are up here, and all you in the audience who brought amazing questions and contexts, and all brought together by, honestly, one of the most amazing people I know, my friend Carrie Mae Weems. I am Kendall Phillips, by the way. No, I am not Carrie Mae Weems. I'm Kendall Phillips. I'm a professor of communication and rhetorical studies here, and occasionally the director of the Lender Center for Social Justice. And I will say I'm quite honored, really, on a serious note, and humbled to be among you all and to be behind the caboose. Hamza, if you're the big caboose, I'm the sweeper thing that goes like that. Or as we'd say in my home state of Texas, the last dog barking. Now, to be clear, I have no aspirations of serving as your headliner. My ego is not quite that big. And indeed, the insightful comments from Hamza, from the many presentations, from that amazing opening program by Hank Willis Thomas and Eric Godesman far outstrip any comments I could hope to make. No, I am not here to surpass the pearls of wisdom that have been scattered before us, but rather to gather some of them for safekeeping. Consider me your humble academic custodian, here to pick up a few insights that have been left in Watson Auditorium and put things into some kind of order. And I would add, if you've been here for the whole, most of what I say will sound familiar. You can consider me kind of an academic greatest hits cover band. If you have not been here and you hear great ideas, they're all mine. I'm going to keep it that way. So I will say, in many ways, it's quite fitting to me to have this conversation here at Syracuse University. Now, in addition to the many memory issues circulating in our city and region, like the complicated relationship with the Onondaga Nation and the Haudenosaunee, and the deep divide over the Columbus statue and the subsequent complexities Mayor Walsh discussed a bit earlier, Syracuse has also been a hub of critical discussions about issues of memory. Indeed, it was 22 years ago, almost to the day, that we began what we have as a loose collective that we sometimes call the Public Memory Project, inaugurating it with a powerful conference around the theme of framing public memory, held with tragic serendipity just 2 weeks after the attacks on September 11th. Now, over the intervening decades, we have published numerous articles, a few books, sponsored and supported exhibitions and public forums, developed international partnerships, and hosted several conferences and symposiums, including one in 2005, where I first met a certain illustrious, multiple award-winning artist named Carrie Mae Weems. 20 years you've been putting up with me. That's what deserves a special award. Now, here at Syracuse, we have preferred the term public memory to other options like collective or social memory, and the talks of the symposium have reinforced that preference, at least for me. So I'm going to briefly offer you 3 ways in which I think the concept of public memory helps frame the discussions we've been having over the past 2 days and perhaps recommends some ways of moving forward. 1. Now, as has been evident throughout our time together, our memories are important to us. And one of the reasons that our memories are so important to us is because they are ours. Indeed, one might argue that it is because of our shared memories that we even think of ourselves as a collective, being the kind of collective consciousness Hamza Walker was just talking about, being a public. These memories we collectively hold tell the story of why we are a we, why as individuals we see ourselves as connected, as sharing some essential qualities because we share a past. Memories, as Dalali Kumavea noted a little earlier, that shape the way we imagine ourselves, our community, our nation. And we have a lot of social structures that these memories pass through. Places like family dinner tables, coffee shops, bars, mosques, churches, and synagogues, and in institutional settings like classrooms and museums. Indeed, I think the impetus to teach our history is not so much that we don't repeat it, as it is so we don't forget how we got here, how we got to be us. Which leads, of course, to the kinds of soul-searching questions about what memories get taught in institutional settings that Genevieve de los Santos was noting earlier. These practices of passing on memories become, as Hank Willis Thomas said at the opening session, a, quote, part of our essence, creating generational connections, our memories binding each new generation to those generations past. And we believe them to capture, we hope that they capture what Timur Hammond suggested earlier today, our sense of justice and our chosen trajectory. In this way, the phrase public memory helps us capture that quality in which memories are held by a public and simultaneously publics are held, sustained, nurtured, perpetuated by memory. Brandon Lazor's powerful installation on the Syracuse University quad, serving, as he noted this morning, as an oasis, a space for gathering, a space for comfort. 2. Now, because some of these memories hold us as a public and they seem so important to us, so crucial to our sense of ourselves, we make them visible. We make them published. We push them beyond the realms of traditions or stories or lessons and turn them into steel and stone. The monument is an example of this memory made public writ large. To craft a physical concretization of our sense of the past is to seek to craft a version of that memory in a way that will defy our limits, our time, our mortality. As Carrie Mae Williams noted during the opening session, monuments are manifestations of public, quote, pouring all their energy and effort into bronze, I would add, so as to craft the hegemonic narratives that Timur Hammond was noting earlier today. Now, when we form our memories into these physical markers, we often say that we do so in order that we never forget. But if we're honest with ourselves, we build monuments so that future generations will not only not forget, but they will not remember differently. Monuments are built not only to mark a person, a moment, an event, but to cast it in ways that instruct future generations how to envision that past and how to understand it. As my friend Ethan Madeiret notes, the monument is not matter, it is a concept. Thought of in this way, monuments are remarkably arrogant efforts to outmaneuver the vagaries of time and history. We want to mark our view of the past in such a way that it cannot be forgotten, misremembered, transformed, a strange existential violence done to the ephemeral, dynamic, elusive nature of memory, which is always in a state of flux and transformation. Our attempt to stop those inevitable changes Carrie was talking about this morning. Memorials and monuments then seek to solidify not only our image of the past, but also how we feel about it. Marcel Haddix this morning noted how often we had been talking about hate and grief and celebration and vulnerability. And I would add, monuments also ask us to feel awe, to feel triumph, to feel love, to feel grief. History is, as Marissa Williams had put it a little bit earlier, both understood and felt. And yet, while monuments invite different affective orientations, I want to suggest that they're always underwritten by a feeling, a sense of fear, a fear that our vision of the past might be transformed, rewritten, or abandoned. Now, the ancient Greeks, if I can be allowed one classical moment here, knew this fear of memory. Plato, as an example, feared memory, not only because it could be lost, but because for him, memory was always just a vision of the past. It was not the past. It was imagining. It was a fiction. It was a phantasm. In Plato's thinking, the capacity that allowed us to conjure up image of the past through memory was the same capacity that allowed us to create entirely fictional images. The capacity to remember and to imagine were identical. For this reason, the Greeks, at least in Plato's lineage, feared the dynamic and undisciplined nature of memory and sought instead to discipline it with structures of history and recollection and mnemonic systems. In a way, monuments function in a very similar way, to discipline the past, to bring the cacophony of recollections into a coherent chorus, a chorus we seek to conduct into a future that will outlive us. We seek at times to live, as Eric Godesman put it yesterday afternoon, under the illusion that monuments are permanent, an impulse that may lead, as Julie Ehrlich noted this morning, to an erasure of, quote, the multiplicity of voices that make up our society. Now, I say all this not to condemn the monument, nor to criticize our impulse to make them. The effort to leave a mark on time in such a way as to shape the future seems wrapped into our human nature, a kind of dream, as Hannah Arendt put it, of immortality, an impulse, as Sally Cornelison noted earlier, that goes back for centuries and centuries. But it is worth recalling that our efforts to project our public's memory into the future by making it public through stone and steel are undoubtedly, inevitably doomed to fail. As is the case in many parts of the world, the sacred, revered, essential monuments of one generation become the skateboard parks of the next. Now again, I want to be clear, I say this not to minimize the monument or the intensity of our feelings about them. I do not want to dismiss the ghosts of trauma and pain my friend Delali was mentioning earlier. Far from it. But I do want to recommend a modicum of humility as we project our memories into the yawning space of the future. There is, as Paul Ferber insisted this morning, no permanence. And even the National Mall in Washington, D.C. will inevitably return to the sea. 3. If time is one challenge to projecting our memories in the future, another challenge is the existence of other publics, and who also seek to project their memories into the future. So to think about public memory is to recognize the inherently contested and controversial nature of our claims on the past. One way of thinking about the public then is a kind of network of dialogue and discussion, hence our ideas of public deliberation, public discourse, public opinion, all of these suggesting an inherent relation of argument and discussion to the conception of public. These discussions about memories are, as I think Marissa Williamson was suggesting earlier, a kind of autopsy, a way of seeing ourselves. And yet the illusion of the monument's permanence, the fantasy that we can project our solid image of the past into the future inevitably collides with the hopeful projections of other publics. Now, here I want to be clear and careful. I'm not suggesting an equivalence of all views. I'm not suggesting in any way that every public has equally legitimate moral or just claims on the past. Quite to the contrary, the contest of different visions of the past is exactly what a democracy is meant to debate and contest and ultimately come to judgment about, even if only temporarily, even if only provisionally. This recommends the kind of community-building discussions discussed earlier by Professor De Los Santos and Mayor Walsh. And yet, at the present moment, we find ourselves in a situation where divergent communities making competing claims on the past are unable or unwilling to seek common ground by which to evaluate those claims. We are, as Provost Gretchen Ritter commented during yesterday's opening session, faced with intractable claims on the past and an inability to imagine a shared future. These debates about monuments become a test case for the fragmentation of a culture that increasingly sees its fellow citizens not as only different, but as threatening. And indeed, I saw in the New York Times this morning, there was an Ipsos Axios poll that found 40% of Americans were considering moving to a different state to be near people who shared their values. That fear that envelops the monument, that fear that tells us the monument, that tells us losing the monument, that tells us accepting an alternative view of the past will mean our dissolution leads, as fear often does, to defensiveness, to anger, to hatred. So what to do? No, just kidding. Thank you. So that would be a good one. The horns of the dilemma seem in some ways to be either abandon our memories of the past to avoid conflict, to accept the silencing that Idris Brewster was mentioning earlier, or, as some are choosing, to employ force, to force our vision of the past onto others, to make America. Yet neither option feels satisfying, I hope. Nor does the obvious alternative, which would be simply to abandon the hope of living together at all and simply allowing each public to drift off into isolation, which I'll suggest will inevitably lead back to fear and anger and hatred. Now, I think several of the presentations of the symposium have suggested perhaps an alternative to this trilemma. To return to that aspect of memory that Plato identified in fear, memory's inherent relationship to imagination. Our memories are always fantasies. And while not all fantasies of the past have equal claim, they are all invocations and speculations. They are all, in essence, daydreams. The philosopher Charles Scott identifies a key component of this kind of speculative, imaginary dimension of memory that I think is instructive. He begins with the simple observation that when we remember the past, we are not in the past, but when we remember, I mean really remember, we're not entirely in the present either. We're somewhere in between, lost in memory. Returning to that question, the grammar of memory that came up earlier today, Scott suggests that the proper grammar of memory is not the past tense it was. The proper tense of memory is not the present tense it is. Scott argues the proper tense of memory is the subjunctive, the it might. Now, this seems exactly the point being made by some of the artists we've engaged during this symposium. In the opening session, for example, Eric Godesman framed the work of For Freedom Collective as inserting a kind of ambiguity into public space, adding nuances and question marks, to which Hank Willis Thomas added, the question is the thing that has the stickiness. Perhaps following the insights of these artists, we need to embrace that ambiguity to let those question marks stick with us a little bit longer. Art is one of those experiences that remind us of the inherent ambiguity of life, that we are all living in a state of the subjunctive. We might, we could, and at times we should. That playful spirit seems to be what the Mellon Foundation, as Julie Ehrlich was saying earlier, is working to foster. It's a spirit that Idris Brewster uses to flip the pyramid of expertise to give power to the community creators and create public space that, as he said, constantly being re-envisioned, constantly being reimagined. A spirit that I suspect will guide the dialogue that Hamza Walker is going to stage for us in 2025. Now, at the beginning of this morning, the fabulous Melissa Ewan asked us to consider frames to engage memory, and art is certainly one. If I may be forgiven one final disciplinary moment before I release you to the wine that's, I'm sure, outside, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that while art is one powerful way of engaging and living in fluidity, ambiguity, and contestation, so too is rhetoric. Now, here I don't mean rhetoric in the bombastic, mere words, angry talk way. I mean the classical tradition that I was trained in, rhetoric as that first art of citizenship, the art of public advocacy, the art of reasoning together, the art of coming to judgment, and always an art of the contingent. We don't debate about what we already know. We debate about that which is uncertain. And so, at least for me, this symposium has recommended we engage our public memory with the kind of playful question marks that artists bring, but it has also reminded us of the importance of being able to engage these question marks with others, to engage in the kinds of endless rhetorical debates, deliberations, and dialogues that make up democracy, to live, as Paul Farber noted, in the gaps between what we think we know. Now, of course, Plato didn't like rhetoric any more than he liked art. And he didn't like it because it wasn't certain. So while Plato may have feared rhetoric, and he may have feared imagination, and he may have feared memory, we need those arts to dwell in the contingent, the subjunctive, and the ambiguous, which is the world we live in. So I would say the visual arts, and I would add the rhetorical arts, might just provide the tools to navigate this space, to navigate it together, and perhaps to do so with joy and with hope and with optimism. Thank you. Okay.
I don't know if there's anything more to say. Thank you for that. Amazing. Thank you for this day. Thank you for joining me, all the panelists. Melissa, where are you? Oh, there you are. Come. I know that you must have a few things that you'd like to say.
Well, thank you, Carrie. And again, thank you, everyone, for joining us and for really hanging in there for a long day of really interesting, stimulating conversation. And I think we've set the stage well for part 2 of Monumental Concerns, which will happen in spring 2024 here on campus. There will be a call for papers coming out in the coming weeks, so we will be circulating that shortly, and we hope to see all of you again here on campus spring of 24 for part 2. And there's a small reception out outside of Lightworks, so I hope we will be able to continue this conversation over some snacks and drinks.